Gideon Mercer slammed his fist on the station master's desk so hard the ink bottles rattled. "She is not his bride," he announced, loud enough for every person on that platform to hear. "She's a hired hand, a joke. My cousin paid good money for a real woman, and what showed up?" He turned, pointing straight at May Holloway, who stood 10 feet away with a sealed letter in her hand and 30 pairs of eyes drilling into her back. "That." The laughter started slow. Then it spread. May didn't flinch. She had heard worse. But standing there, in a town she didn't know, delivering news that would break a stranger's heart, while a man she'd never met publicly reduced her to a punchline, something old and quiet moved behind her eyes. She looked at Caleb Mercer. He wasn't laughing. If you've ever walked into a room and felt every single person decide who you were before you opened your mouth, this story is for you. If you've ever been the wrong answer to someone else's question, stay with me. Because what happened next on that platform in northern Montana changed two lives in ways neither of them saw coming. Before we go further, if you're watching this for the first time, please consider subscribing to our channel. We tell stories about ordinary people who carry extraordinary strength, and we don't want you to miss a single one. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. I genuinely want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to that platform. Because Caleb Mercer just made a decision that nobody in Harlan's Creek expected. The letter had been folded and unfolded so many times the crease was nearly worn through. May Holloway had read it exactly once, in the back of a jolting stagecoach somewhere between Billings and the middle of nowhere, and she had not read it again. She didn't need to. The words were the kind that burned themselves in. "I cannot go. I am sorry. Please tell him. Please do it kindly." Signed by a woman named Clara Fitch, who had spent a year exchanging careful, hopeful letters with a rancher she'd never met, and then, at the very last moment, chosen the safety of what she already knew over the risk of what she didn't. May understood that. She didn't judge Clara for it. Some people needed the familiar the way other people needed air. What May had not anticipated was delivering the news at a public train station with half a town watching. Harlan's Creek, Montana was not a large town. It had a general store, a livery, a land office, a saloon that doubled as a courthouse on Fridays, and an opinion about everything. When the westbound train pulled in that Tuesday in late July of 1885, at least 40 people had gathered, not because trains were unusual, but because Caleb Mercer's mail-order bride was arriving, and in a town this size, that was practically a civic event. May stepped off the train behind a family of 4, a traveling salesman with too many bags, and an old woman who moved like she had all the time left in the world. May was not small. She was built wide across the shoulders, had hands that showed real work, wore a trail duster that had seen better decades, and carried a coiled lariat on her left hip the way other women carried handbags. She did not look like a bride. She knew exactly what she looked like. She scanned the platform until she found the man holding a small bouquet of wildflowers, the kind of detail Clara had mentioned in her letters. That Caleb Mercer always did something like that, something that seemed too soft for a cattle rancher but somehow wasn't. He was tall, lean in the way of men who worked rather than worried about it, with a jaw that needed a shave and eyes that were currently confused in a way they were trying hard to conceal. May walked toward him. That was when Gideon Mercer stepped in front of her. She had not noticed him before. He was the type of man who stood slightly behind things, slightly to the side, positioned so he could watch without being watched. But now he moved with sudden purpose, cutting the distance between them like he'd been waiting for exactly this moment. "Hold on," he said. He wasn't talking to her. He was talking to the crowd, to the station master, to his cousin, to everyone at once. Something's wrong here. May stopped walking, not because she was afraid of him, because she was carrying someone else's bad news, and she had enough sense to know this was already complicated without adding a collision. Gideon was handsome the way some snakes are, smooth and well-maintained. He wore his coat like he wanted you to notice it. He had the kind of smile that appeared before the rest of his face caught up with it. "Clara Fitch is a woman," he said, gesturing at May with an open hand, the kind of gesture you'd use to present evidence. "This is not Clara Fitch." "No," May said evenly. "It's not." That was when he hit the station master's desk. The boom of his fist against the wood cut through the platform noise like a shot, and the crowd went quiet, the way crowds do when they smell something about to happen. "She is not his bride," Gideon announced. And then the pointing, and then the word that, the laughter that followed was not the cruel belly laugh of bad people. It was the nervous, relieved laughter of people who had been standing in July heat waiting for something to happen and were just grateful for a target that wasn't them. Most of them would feel bad about it later. In the moment, they laughed. May held the letter. She looked at Caleb. He was not laughing. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite place. Not pity, not embarrassment, not the bracing for disaster look she'd expected. He was just looking at her, like he was actually seeing her, which was not a thing most men bothered to do. He stepped around his cousin like Gideon was a fence post. "I'm Caleb Mercer," he said, extending his hand. May shook it. His grip was solid, and he didn't perform it. "May Holloway, I have a letter for you from Clara Fitch." She held it out. "I'm sorry. She asked me to deliver it in person instead of just disappearing. She thought you deserved that much." Something moved across his face. It was fast, and it was real, and then it was gone. He took the letter. He didn't open it right there, which May noted. Most people would have ripped it open, needing to know, needing to respond to the knowing. Caleb Mercer just folded it once and put it in his vest pocket. "Thank you for coming all this way," he said. It was such a plain thing to say, such a plain, decent thing, when he could have said any number of other things. When he could have been angry or lost or performed composure badly the way men sometimes did. Instead, he just thanked her for the inconvenience of delivering his heartbreak in person. "You're welcome," May said, because she didn't know what else to say, and she respected plain decency enough to match it. "Caleb." Gideon materialized at his cousin's elbow with the smoothness of practice. "Don't you want to know why she didn't come?" "I'll read the letter. She sent a ranch hand to break off your engagement, in front of the whole town. That's an insult." Gideon's voice was pitched to Carrie. Everything about him was pitched to Carrie. "You should—" "She sent someone," Caleb said quietly, "instead of nothing. That was kind." He didn't look at Gideon when he said it. He was still looking at May. "You have somewhere to be, Miss Holloway?" May had assumed she was already planning her next move. She had $12, a return ticket she'd have to sell if she wanted to eat on the way back, and a vague promise of work near Billings that might or might not still be open. She didn't volunteer any of that. "Not immediately," she said. "There's a diner 2 blocks east," he said. "Best coffee in the county, which isn't saying much, but it's something. If you'd allow me—" He paused, looking momentarily uncertain, which was the most human expression she'd seen on anyone in days. "I'd appreciate the chance to ask you a few questions about the journey, about Clara, not because I'm angry, just because I've been corresponding with someone for a year, and I'd like to understand." Gideon's mouth opened. Caleb finally looked at him. "Go check on the north pasture fence, Gideon. The one you said was fine last week and wasn't." Something flickered in Gideon's eyes. Not hurt, exactly. Calculation interrupted. He smiled, nodded, and walked away. And May watched him go the way she watched unfamiliar horses. Carefully. The coffee was in fact terrible. May drank it gratefully. She'd had worse, and there was something to be said for terrible coffee in a warm place after 3 days on a train. Caleb Mercer sat across from her in a corner booth of Hankins' diner and read Clara's letter in its entirety before he said a single word. May watched the road outside the window and gave him the privacy of it. When he folded the letter and set it on the table, his hands were very still. "She met someone," he said. Not a question. "Her neighbor's son came home from school back east," May said. "She'd known him since they were children. She said she realized she'd been looking for something she already had, and she was sorry she figured it out too late." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "That's a good reason," he said finally. May looked at him. "You think so?" "Better than most." He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "She could have just not shown up. I've heard of that. Man stands on a platform like a fool, and the train comes and goes, and there's nothing." He looked at the letter. "She sent you instead. That took nerve." "It took nerve on her end," May agreed. "Took something else on mine." That almost got a smile. Not quite, but almost. "What made you say yes to that?" May considered lying, then didn't see the point of it. "She was crying, and I was the only person at that coach station. Sometimes the job comes to you because nobody else is there." "Where were you headed originally?" "Billings. Maybe. I had a line on work." He looked at her hands on the table. not with impropriety, with the frank assessment of someone who knew what real work looked like and was clocking it. What kind of work? Cattle mostly, some horse work, fence repair when there's nothing else. She met his eyes without apology. I'm good at it. I don't doubt it. He said it simply, and she believed he meant it simply, which was unusual. Men usually said things like that with a little edge in it. The for a woman that they didn't say out loud but that lived behind the words. Caleb Mercer either didn't have that edge or kept it somewhere she couldn't find it. The ranch is struggling, he said, with the same flatness as everything else, as if struggling were just a fact and not a shame. I'm sorry. My father left it to me with a condition. I have to meet a stability requirement by September 30th, or the property passes to his estate trustee for liquidation. That's 2 months away. He paused. I have good men. I don't have enough of them, and I've been losing time to legal challenges I didn't expect. May was quiet for a moment, turning her coffee cup. She knew she should not ask the next question. She should finish the coffee, sell the return ticket, and catch the next thing going toward Billings. What kind of legal challenges? Caleb looked at her for a beat before answering. My cousin believes the ranch should have come to him. He's been finding creative ways to make that argument to judges. Your cousin, May said. The one on the platform. The one on the platform. She picked up her coffee, set it down. You said the ranch is struggling. How short-handed are you? I could use 3 men. What I have is the money to pay for 1.5, if I'm careful. He said this without self-pity, which she respected. I'm not looking for charity. I'm trying to be honest with you because you were honest with me. It was that sentence. That was the one that did it. In May Holloway's experience, and she had 34 years of it, none of them particularly soft. Honesty was not a thing most people led with. They arrived at it eventually, or they didn't, but they didn't start there. Caleb Mercer had gotten his heart delivered in pieces on a public platform, and his first instinct, apparently, was to be honest with the person who brought them. She would think about that sentence for a long time afterward. I'll work 30 days, she said. Fair wage, same as you'd pay any hand. After 30 days, if the arrangement isn't working for either of us, we part clean. He looked at her with that same steady expression. I don't need you to feel sorry for me, Miss Holloway. Good, she said, because I don't. He held out his hand across the table. She shook it. The ride out to Broken Ridge Ranch took 40 minutes by wagon, and Gideon Mercer appeared like weather you hadn't checked for, suddenly and inconveniently, about 10 minutes into it. He rode up beside them on a gray horse that was too nice for him, in May's assessment, and fell into pace with the wagon without being invited. Cousin, he said pleasantly, who's your guest? Ranch hand, Caleb said. May Holloway, 30 days. Gideon turned his smile on May. Up close, she could see the precision of him, everything placed just right. Miss Holloway, quite a day you've had. Average, she said. Something sharpened behind his eyes, just briefly. People who expected to unsettle you and found they couldn't sometimes looked like that, recalibrating. You do cattle work, among other things. And Caleb, what does the estate trustee say about new hires, given the current financial requirements? Caleb's jaw tightened. The estate's trustee says I can run my own ranch, Gideon. For now. He said it lightly, pleasantly, like a man who was certain he was going to win and was generous enough not to rub it in prematurely. Just want to be sure everything's done properly. Wouldn't want any irregularities. He glanced at May. Of any kind. Then he peeled away, back toward the road, and May watched him go. Does he do that often? She asked. Every few days, Caleb said. And you've been dealing with that while also trying to save a ranch. Welcome to Broken Ridge, he said. There was something dry in it. Not quite humor. The thing that lives next door to humor when times are hard. The ranch itself appeared over a low rise in the road, and May's first thought was that it had good bones. The main house needed paint. The barn needed a new section of roof. The fencing along the east side was leaning in ways that fencing wasn't meant to lean. But the land itself, the way it sat and breathed in the afternoon light, had something in it that was worth fighting for. She had learned to tell the difference between land that was dying and land that was resting. Broken Ridge Ranch was resting. She intended to wake it up. A woman of about 70 appeared on the porch before the wagon had fully stopped, compact and white-haired and regarding May with the particular expression of someone who had learned not to be surprised by anything but retained the right to evaluate it thoroughly. "This is Edna Briggs," Caleb said. "She's kept this house running since my father's time. Edna, this is May Holloway. She'll be staying in the bunkhouse." Edna Briggs looked May up and down the way a jeweler looks at a stone. Not unkind, just thorough. "You eat before you arrived?" "Station diner," May said. "Biscuit and water." "That's not eating," Edna said. "Come inside." Not an invitation, a directive. May climbed down from the wagon. 3 ranch hands had materialized near the barn. 2 young ones trying not to stare and failing, and 1 older man with a weathered face who had the look of someone who'd seen enough of the world that almost nothing registered as strange anymore. He gave her a single nod. She nodded back. That was the extent of the welcome. May had worked for worse first days. She followed Edna Briggs into the kitchen, sat at a wooden table that had been scrubbed so many times it had nearly gone smooth, and ate beef stew that was considerably better than the coffee at Hankins had been. Edna Briggs did not attempt small talk. She asked May 3 questions. Could she shoe a horse? Could she cook in an emergency? Had she ever worked with cattle through a Montana winter? May answered yes, barely, and once. Edna nodded at each answer as though it was scoring points in some internal assessment May couldn't see. Then she cleared the bowl without comment and showed May to the bunkhouse. Standing outside it in the cooling July dusk, May looked back at the main house. Caleb Mercer was on the porch, his back to her, reading Claire's letter again. She looked away. Whatever that letter contained, whatever that year of correspondence had built in him, it was not her business. She had delivered it. She had taken a job. She was here to work, to save a little money, and to leave in 30 days with her wage and her dignity intact. That was the plan. Plans, as May Holloway had reason to know, did not always survive contact with the actual world. She unrolled her bedding, hung her duster on the wall peg, and set her lariat within arm's reach, the way other people might set a lamp. Then she lay in the dark of the bunkhouse and listened to the sounds of Broken Ridge Ranch, the cattle shifting, the wind in the eaves, the distant creak of what sounded like that compromised fence on the east side. And she thought, this place needs someone who knows what they're doing. She had not planned on being that someone, but she was already calculating where to start. The first morning at Broken Ridge started before the sun did. May was up at 4:30 out of habit, not ambition. She had slept in worse places than that bunkhouse. At least the roof didn't leak, and the other hands, 2 young men named Pete and Danny, were respectful enough to pretend they weren't surprised she was already dressed when they rolled out of their bunks at 5. The third man, the older one who had nodded at her the evening before, turned out to have a name, Walt Greer. He was 50-something, built low to the ground and solid, and he moved around the barn with the economy of someone who had done the same task so many times he no longer needed to think about them. He handed her a coffee tin without being asked. "Caleb said you're taking the east fence line today," Walt said. "Not a question, not a challenge, just information." "That's the one that's leaning," May said. "That's the one that's been leaning since March. Couple posts rotted at the base. Danny went out twice to look at it and came back saying it needed more supplies than we had." He paused. He wasn't wrong about the supplies. "What do we have?" Walt listed what was in the supply barn. May did the math out loud, not because she needed help with it, but because Walt was clearly a man who needed to see that she knew what she was doing before he was going to commit to anything. She'd worked with men like that before. They were not the problem. They were the ones worth earning. By the time she finished the inventory calculation, Walt was nodding slowly. "Might work," he said. "It'll work," May said. "Might not be pretty. Pretty fence doesn't hold cattle any better than an ugly one." "That's exactly right," she said. That was how she and Walt Greer became something resembling a working partnership, over a tin of bad coffee and a supply count, before the sun had cleared the eastern hills. She took Danny with her to the east fence line because Danny was young and eager in the way of someone who wanted to prove himself and didn't yet know how to do it without getting in his own way. May had learned that the fastest way to settle that kind of energy was to give it a real job and let it tire itself out against something actual rather than imaginary. She found the compromise section within 20 minutes. Walt had been right. 2 posts were rotted clean through at the base, and a third had been knocked sideways by something large, probably a spooked steer based on the ground disturbance around it. The leaning she'd noticed from the wagon the evening before was actually worse than it looked at distance. 3 more feet of wire had pulled loose from a post further down the line, and a section of the ground there had been churned up by cattle that had found the weak point and tested it. "They've been pushing here," May said, more to herself than Danny. "Yeah." Danny scuffed the ground with his boot. "We thought it was just the 2 posts." "It's the 2 posts and the wire tension on the whole section. You fix the posts without adjusting the wire, it'll pull loose again inside a week." She looked down the line. "Has Caleb walked this fence recently?" "Mr. Mercer's been in town a lot. The legal stuff." Danny said it carefully, the way young people sometimes talked about problems that were bigger than them. May took in the full quarter-mile of fence with the particular attention she gave to things that were about to cost more than expected. Then she set down her tool roll and got to work. It took most of the morning and all of the supplies she'd calculated. Danny turned out to be genuinely useful once he stopped trying to anticipate what she wanted and just responded to what she asked for. He was quick, and he didn't complain, which were both better qualities than they sounded. By the time the sun was straight overhead, they had replaced both rotted posts, reset the knocked one, retensioned the wire on the full compromise section, and added a temporary brace to the next post down the line that was showing early signs of the same rot. Danny stood back and looked at it. "That's cleaner than I thought it was going to be. I told you it'd work. You also said it might not be pretty." May looked at the fence. It was not, in fact, pretty, but it was solid, and solid was the point. "Still isn't pretty," she said, "but it'll hold." They were back at the barn by early afternoon, and May went looking for the rest of the east fence line on foot. Not because Caleb had asked her to, but because she had a compulsion about unfinished pictures. If one section had rotted posts, she wanted to know about the others. She found 2 more trouble spots over the next 2 hours. Neither was as bad as the first, but both needed attention before the end of the month. She made notes on a scrap of paper from her vest pocket. Column of numbers. A rough sketch of where along the fence line each spot sat. Estimated supplies needed. When she got back to the main barn, she left the paper on the small wooden shelf just inside the door, where she'd noticed Walt leaving notes for Caleb. She didn't mention it to anyone. She was washing up at the pump when she heard the argument. It was coming from inside the main house, and the walls of the house were old enough that they didn't contain sound the way newer construction might. She wasn't trying to listen. She was wringing out her bandana when Gideon's voice came through the kitchen window clear as a bell. "She's not a ranch hand, Caleb. She's a liability. The moment the estate trustee sees you've hired some drifter off a train platform." "I hired a qualified worker." Caleb's voice was lower, harder to read. "A woman. On a working cattle ranch. In the middle of a legal challenge over your fitness to manage this property." A pause that had satisfaction in it. "Do you understand how that looks? I am trying to help you. I am trying to make sure you keep this ranch, and you are making it so much more difficult than it needs to be." "What would you suggest, Gideon?" "Send her back. Pay her for the day. Get yourself a real solution." "I had a real solution," Caleb said, quiet now. "She got off that train this morning instead." The silence after that was different. May turned off the pump. She went back to the bunkhouse. She sat on the edge of her bunk and looked at her boots and thought, 30 days. 30 days and a fair wage. She had made a clean deal, and she intended to keep it. Gideon Mercer was not her problem. His opinions of what she was or wasn't were not her problem. She had fixed fence today and found 2 more sections that needed work and left detailed notes for the man who needed them. That was the job. The job was the job. She told herself that until she believed it, which took about 10 minutes. By the end of the first week, the ranch hands had developed opinions about May Holloway that they had not started with. Pete, the younger of the two, had initially treated her with an exaggerated politeness that was more awkward than rude, the kind of behavior that comes from not knowing what category to put someone in. By day 3, he'd dropped it, mostly because May had spent 40 minutes on day 2 helping him work through a problem with a horse that kept refusing to load into the trailer, and she'd done it without making him feel stupid about not knowing the answer himself. After that, he treated her the way he treated Walt, with the casual, functional respect of someone working beside you. Walt was more deliberate about it. He watched her for the full first week without committing to anything, and May let him. On the 7th day, he came to her with the sick calf. It was a 3-week-old that had been off its feed and showing signs of scours, not unusual and usually manageable if caught early, But this one had gotten worse over 2 days because nobody had been quite sure whose job it was to deal with it. By the time Walt brought May to the barn at dusk on that 7th day, the calf was down and weak, and the look on Walt's face said he'd already decided it was a lost cause and was bringing her in out of obligation rather than hope. May sat with that calf for 4 hours. She did not perform any miracles. She used what was in the medicine chest and what she knew from 15 years of hard experience and a stubbornness that was not the same as optimism but could look like it from certain angles. At around 10 o'clock at night, the calf got up. It was shaky. It was not recovered, but it got up. Walt watched from the other side of the stall gate, arms folded over the top rail. He was quiet for a long time. "Where'd you learn cattle medicine?" he asked finally. "My uncle's ranch in Wyoming, and 3 other ranches after that." She scratched the calf behind one floppy ear. "And failing the first time." "You've lost calves. More than I care to count." She stood up, her knees complaining about it the way they always did now. "You don't learn from the ones that make it. You learn from the ones that don't." Walt nodded once, the way he had nodded at her that first evening on the porch. But this nod was different. This one meant something. Caleb Mercer came into the barn at 10:30, still in his working clothes, looking like a man who had forgotten to eat supper. He stopped when he saw May sitting on a hay bale outside the calf's stall and Walt standing with her. "Walt told me," he said. "She's not out of it yet," May said, "but she's better. Give her another day and honest food and she'll likely pull through." He leaned against the stall gate and looked at the calf and didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "Thank you." May had been thanked before, plenty of times. Usually it felt like a transaction, services rendered, acknowledgement given, done. When Caleb Mercer said thank you, it had a different weight. She could not fully explain that. She wasn't sure she wanted to examine it. "It's the job," she said, and went to wash her hands. The trouble started on a Tuesday, which seemed about right. May was in the far south pasture checking on a section of ground that Caleb had said sometimes flooded after rain, trying to assess whether the drainage issue was correctable before the fall, when she heard horses on the road. She didn't look up immediately. Horses on the road were not unusual. Then she heard Gideon's voice. She still didn't look up, because looking up would require engaging, and she was in the middle of a thought. But Gideon was not talking to her. He was talking to 2 men on horseback beside him, and he was talking at a volume calibrated so that she would hear every word. "You see, the problem with my cousin is that he is sentimental," Gideon was saying. He felt sorry for her. The bride he ordered didn't show up, and he felt sorry for the woman who came instead, so now she's living on the property, and the hands don't know what to do with her, and the ranch is essentially being run by a woman who arrived on a train platform with nowhere else to go. It's charity, dressed up as employment. One of the men on horseback said something she couldn't quite make out. "Oh, I'm sure she works hard," Gideon said generously. "But a struggling ranch can't afford charity cases." And when the estate trustee hears that Caleb brought on an unvetted drifter in the middle of a legal challenge over management fitness, well, he let that sit there for a moment. It doesn't help his case. May straightened up. She turned around and looked at Gideon Mercer, and he looked back at her with that precisely placed smile, and something in her chest went still and cold the way it did sometimes when she was deciding something. She could say something. There were things to say. There were pointed, accurate, devastating things she could say about Gideon Mercer in this moment that she had been assembling quietly since the train platform, and she was not a woman who lacked for words when she chose to use them. She turned back to the drainage ditch. "Miss Holloway," Gideon called, "don't you want to defend yourself?" "Against what?" she said, not turning around. A beat of silence. "Well," he said, "that's interesting." She said. She heard the horses move away. She heard Gideon say something to his companions in a lower voice. Not low enough to be private, she thought, but low enough to be deniable. Then they were gone. She stood in the south pasture for a while after that, thinking about drainage and not about Gideon Mercer, and she was mostly successful. When she got back to the ranch that evening, she went to Caleb's small office and knocked on the open door. He was at his desk, which was buried in papers in the way of a man who was not naturally disorganized but had recently been given more paper than he had space for. "I need to talk to you about the south pasture drainage," she said. He looked up, read her face briefly, the way he had learned to do over this past week and a half. And, he said, and nothing else. He held her gaze for a moment, then nodded. Tell me about the drainage. She sat in the chair across from his desk and laid out what she'd found and what she thought could be done about it and what it would cost. He listened without interrupting, which she had come to expect from him and still found notable. When she finished, he asked 2 questions, both of them practical, both of them the right questions. And then he nodded. Can you write it up for me, the way you did the fence notes? Already did. She slid a folded paper across his desk. I wrote it up in the pasture. He took the paper and unfolded it and looked at her sketch and her numbers, and something shifted in his expression that she couldn't read entirely. You've been doing this all week, he said, not accusatory, just realizing it. That's what you're paying me for. I'm paying you to mend fence and manage cattle. I mended the fence, she said. The cattle aren't currently on fire. This seemed like useful time. He looked back down at the paper. A corner of his mouth moved. I saw Gideon riding the South Road today. She said. That's the same thing you said to him, isn't it? She stood up. Good night, Caleb. Good night, May. She was almost out the door when he said, Thank you for handling that the way you did. She stopped, didn't turn around. I didn't do anything. That's what I mean, he said. She found the ledger error on day 16. It was not something she had been looking for. Edna Briggs had pressed her into helping reorganize a stack of supply receipts that had been living in a wooden box in the kitchen for reasons nobody could fully explain, and May had been cross-referencing them against the supply ledger out of habit, the same compulsion that made her walk fence lines she hadn't been asked to inspect. The discrepancy was not dramatic. It would have been easy to miss, and whoever had missed it the first time had probably done so honestly. But over 18 months, a recurring error in the way feed costs were being categorized had created a significant gap between what the books showed Broken Ridge was spending and what it was actually spending. The ranch looked, on paper, like it was hemorrhaging money on feed supplies at a rate that made the whole operation look borderline insolvent. It was not insolvent. It was being inaccurately reported. May sat at the kitchen table with both ledgers open and 3 years of receipts spread around her and went over it twice to be sure. Then she went over it a third time. Then she put everything back in the same order it had been in, carried both ledgers under her arm, and knocked on Caleb's office door. He was on the phone. The ranch had one telephone, which worked perhaps 60% of the time and sounded like the other 40% was someone frying bacon. And he held up a finger without looking at her. She sat down and waited. When he hung up, his expression was already tired. Gideon's attorney, he said. New filing. What kind? The kind that costs money to respond to. He rubbed the back of his neck. I have an attorney of my own, but he's not cheap. And this is the 3rd challenge in 2 months, and He stopped himself. Sorry, that's not your problem. Look at this, May said, and put the ledgers on the desk. She walked him through it, methodically, the way she would explain a fence problem. Here's the damage, here's how far it runs, here's what the actual structure looks like underneath the rot. Caleb followed it with his eyes moving fast, and she watched the moment he understood what he was looking at. This is 18 months of, he started. Your feed costs on paper are about 40% higher than they actually are. The categorization error goes back to the bookkeeper you had before Walt took over record keeping, and Walt's been maintaining the same system without realizing the base was wrong. She set a single sheet of paper on top of the open ledger. These are the correct numbers. Your operation is running lean, but it is not running at a loss. Anyone reading these books the way they're currently kept would think you're spending yourself into the ground. Caleb was very still. Your attorney, May said carefully, has he been arguing your financial stability based on these books? Yes. Then the estate trustee's assessment of your fitness has been based on numbers that aren't real. He sat back in his chair hard enough that it creaked. He stared at the ledger. This is fixable, she said. The actual numbers are right there in the receipts. It's correctable with documentation. Gideon's attorney has copies of these ledgers. I know. They've been using this as evidence that the ranch is... I know, she said again, quieter. He put both hands flat on the desk. His jaw was tight, and he was looking at the middle distance and processing something, and she gave him time to do it. After a while, he said, Did you know this when you suggested I look at the South Pasture drainage? The one that would have been a significant project based on the numbers in these books? No, she said honestly. I found this today. He looked at her. Edna asked you to sort receipts. I sort things thoroughly. Something crossed his face that was too complicated to name. It wasn't quite gratitude, and it wasn't quite wonder. It was something that happened when a person looked at the same landscape they'd been looking at for years and suddenly saw it was different than they thought. He picked up the telephone. Oh. The correction of the ledger error took 3 days of intensive backwork by Caleb's attorney, who drove out from town with barely concealed excitement at what he clearly considered a significant development. Gideon appeared at the ranch on the second of those 3 days with his own attorney and spent an hour in Caleb's office being told, with professional restraint, that the financial picture of Broken Ridge Ranch was considerably more stable than previously documented. May was fixing a paddock gate when they left. She heard Gideon's voice as he crossed the yard, that smooth, calibrated tone, saying something about procedural this and estate law that. His attorney nodded. They walked past her with the particular momentum of people who are changing plans without showing it. Gideon paused when he reached her. Quite the discovery, he said. She didn't look up from the gate hinge. Gate was sticking. The ledger, Miss Holloway. Oh. She set the hinge pin. That. You've been busy. I've been working, she said. There's a difference. He stood there for a moment. She could feel him deciding something. You are smarter than you look, he said finally. It was meant to land as a compliment. It didn't. Most people are, May said, and went back to the gate. She heard his footsteps move away, and then the sound of horses, and then nothing but the normal sounds of the ranch, cattle and wind, and the distant bang of Pete doing something inadvisable near the hay bales. She swung the gate. It moved clean and easy. She moved on to the next one. That evening, Edna Briggs set a piece of dried apple pie on the table in front of May without comment, which was about as demonstrative as Edna Briggs got. May ate it. It was the best thing she had put in her mouth in weeks, and she said so, and Edna made a sound that in another woman would have been a pleased laugh. Caleb's father used to say this ranch would find what it needed, Edna said, collecting plates. Man was a bit grandiose, honestly, but he wasn't always wrong. May looked out the kitchen window at the darkening yard. He was lucky with the land. Land is just land, Edna said. It's what people do with it. She set the last dish in the basin. You're staying past 30 days. It was not a question. May opened her mouth, closed it, looked at the window. We'll see, she said. Edna dried her hands on her apron. That means yes, she said, and went to bed. May sat at the kitchen table for a while after that, with the lamp burning low and the sounds of the ranch settling into its nighttime rhythms, and she thought about the gate she had fixed and the fence she had repaired and the calf that had lived and the numbers that had turned out to be wrong in the right direction. She thought about a man who thanked people plainly and meant it. She thought about 30 days. She was on day 16, and the honest truth, the kind she was only willing to admit in the dark, to no one, in a kitchen that smelled like dried apples and lamp oil, was that Broken Ridge Ranch had started to feel, in some quiet and inconvenient way, like somewhere she had been before. She couldn't explain that. She wasn't going to try. She blew out the lamp and went to bed, and she did not lie awake wondering about it for more than an hour, which she counted as a reasonable performance. The storage room off the back of the main barn had been accumulating the evidence of decades without anyone meaning it to. It was one of those spaces that starts as a temporary solution. Just put it in there for now. We'll sort it later. And then later never comes. And the next thing you know, there are 3 generations of broken tools, outdated tack, water-damaged crates, and items that were meaningful enough to keep but not important enough to retrieve. Caleb had mentioned it twice in passing, both times with the slightly embarrassed tone of a man acknowledging a problem he hadn't had the bandwidth to address. May had looked at the door twice and felt the itch that she felt around anything disorganized and uncategorized. On day 22, she went in. She told herself it was practical. The barn needed the space. Some of what was stored might be usable. She was not doing it because she needed something to think about other than the fact that her 30 days were 8 days from ending, and she had not yet decided what she was doing after that, despite what Edna had said in the kitchen. The first hour was straightforward. Broken items to one pile, salvageable to another, genuinely useful to a third. She found 2 good saddle blankets under a rusted cultivator, a set of leather working tools in better shape than they had any right to be, and enough spare fencing wire coiled in the back corner to handle the 2 additional problem spots she'd identified on the east line. Then she found the box. It was a wooden crate, medium-sized, set on a shelf above eye level and pushed to the back, which was probably why it had survived undisturbed. It had no label. The wood was old and darkened with age, and when she pulled it down, it was heavier than expected. Not heavy with equipment weight, but heavy in the denser way of things carefully packed. She set it on the floor and opened it. The top layer was newspaper, folded neatly, from 1877. Under the newspaper was folded canvas, an old slicker, a wool blanket, the detritus of someone's traveling life kept for reasons nobody left alive probably remembered. She moved each piece carefully, setting things aside, and near the bottom of the crate, under a small bundle of letters tied with twine. Her hand closed around something stiff and textile, and she pulled it out and looked at it. It was half a saddle blanket. The remaining half of a saddle blanket, to be precise, cut or torn along a ragged edge that ran diagonally, the kind of edge that came from fire rather than a blade. The remaining fabric was old wool, faded brown and cream, and along the intact border ran an embroidered pattern of sunflowers, worked in yellow and gold thread that had gone dim with age but was still clearly, unmistakably, sunflowers. May's hands stopped moving. She sat on the floor of the storage room with that half blanket in her hands, and she did not move for what might have been a full minute. She had made that blanket herself, at 18 years old, sitting with her grandmother on the porch of a house that was later sold and then later burned down in a different fire from the one that mattered. She had embroidered those sunflowers badly the first time and unpicked them and redone them twice before she was satisfied, and she had carried that blanket for 12 years because it was one of the few things she had that were entirely hers. She had wrapped it around an unconscious man in a wildfire in the summer of 1877. She had been 22, working a cattle drive that had come too close to a section of prairie fire that moved faster than the scouts expected. She'd gotten separated from the main group and found him trapped under a fallen horse, unconscious, with smoke thickening around both of them. She had no memory of being afraid in that moment. There had been too much to do to also be afraid. She'd freed him from the horse, which was already gone, and she had gotten him to a dry creek bed with the fire cutting close on both sides, and she had wrapped him in her blanket because he was shaking, and she was too busy moving to be cold. She had not known his name. She had left before he woke up because the drive was moving and she had never been able to afford to stay anywhere long. She had assumed he survived because she had needed to assume that. But she had never known. She turned the half blanket over in her hands. The embroidery on the corner, the specific little cluster of 4 sunflowers she had put there as a kind of signature because her grandmother had told her to always put her mark on her best work, was intact. This was her blanket. Half of it. She heard footsteps on the barn floor outside, and then Caleb was in the doorway, holding 2 cups of coffee, clearly intending to check on her progress, seeing her sitting on the floor with something in her lap, and stopping. May. She looked up at him. She didn't know what her face was doing, but whatever it was made him step into the room and set both cups down on the nearest surface and come to where she was, not rushing it, but not hesitating either. He crouched down and looked at the fabric in her hands, and she watched his face change. The change was not dramatic. It was the kind of thing that happened underneath a person's expression more than on top of it. His eyes went from concern to something else, something with recognition in it, and more than recognition, a door opening onto something he had kept closed for a long time. "Where did you find that?" he said, and his voice was careful the way voices got when they were trying to stay level. "In a crate. On the shelf." She turned the fabric so the sunflowers faced him. "This is mine," she said. "I embroidered those. I made this blanket." Caleb was very still. 1877, she said. "A fire. I found a man under a fallen horse, and I got him to a creek bed, and She stopped, looked at him. "I left him my blanket because he was cold, and I had to keep moving." She had never said this out loud to anyone. Not because she was keeping it secret, but because it had never come up, and also because there was something about it that had always felt too fragile to put into regular conversation. A thing she had carried that had no proper home in the regular world. Caleb stood up. He went to the other side of the storage room, to a larger wooden trunk that sat against the back wall under a canvas drop cloth. He pulled the drop cloth aside, opened the trunk, and reached in without needing to look, the way people reached for things they had touched in the dark many times before. He turned around. In his hands was the other half of the blanket. Same diagonal tear, same faded wool. Along the edge, the cut ends of sunflower embroidery thread, the flowers that had been on May's half now finished on his, the petals that had been separated for 8 years suddenly resolving into complete flowers when the two pieces were held close. May got up off the floor. She crossed the storage room and took the half he was holding and fitted against the half she was holding, and the torn edges met the way torn edges did when they had once been the same thing. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. "You were barely breathing," she said finally. "The horse had your legs. I thought you might have broken bones. I didn't stay to find out. I had to get back to the drive or lose my job, and I couldn't afford to lose that job, and I have thought about whether you lived or died 100 times, and I lived," he said. "I can see that." Something that was not quite a laugh moved through him. It didn't make it all the way to his face, but it moved through him. "Broken leg, 2 cracked ribs. I had smoke in my lungs for a month." He looked at his half of the blanket. "My father found me. The hands found me first, actually. I was in that creek bed, and they found me with a stranger's blanket. And I couldn't explain it. I didn't know who she was. I only knew she had sunflowers on everything she owned because—" He stopped. "Because?" May said. "Because when I woke up, there was a thread," he said. "Just one thread that had come loose, and it was yellow, and it was stuck to my hand, and I kept it for—" He stopped again, shook his head at himself. "That's a strange thing to tell a person. You kept a thread." "I was 18 and I had almost died, and someone had saved me and disappeared," he said, with a defensive plainness that was somehow more honest than anything elaborate would have been. "Yes, I kept the thread." May looked at the two halves of the blanket joined in her hands. She had always thought of that fire as an ending, a moment that was complete in itself, sealed off, with no before or after except her own continuing life moving away from it. She had never considered that it might have been a beginning of something she wasn't present for. That a man had woken up in a creek bed and carried a yellow thread for 8 years and then grown up and bought a cattle ranch in northern Montana and spent a year writing careful letters to a woman named Clara Fitch. That life could be that strange and that patient at the same time. "Say something," Caleb said. He was watching her face. "I don't know what to say," May said, which was genuinely true and genuinely unusual for her. "That happens to me too," he said. "Mostly when things matter." She looked up at him. He was standing close enough that she could have stepped back and created comfortable distance. And she noticed that she did not step back. And she noticed that he noticed. And then they were both noticing the same thing at the same time, and the whole room got very quiet. "Caleb," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not—" She started. "I know," he said again. She folded both halves of the blanket together, the sunflowers overlapping, the torn edges hidden in the fold, and she held them against her chest with both arms, the way you held something breakable, and she turned around and walked out of the storage room into the main barn, into the light, because she needed the light and the noise of the ranch and the completely unromantic smell of horses and hay and manure to put herself back in order. She stood in the center of the barn and breathed. Pete walked through carrying a bridle and glanced at her and said, "You okay?" And she said, "Fine." And he said, "Okay," and continued walking, which was the perfect response and exactly what she needed. She was still standing there when Caleb came out of the storage room and stood on the other side of the barn aisle. "I'm not going to make this into something complicated," she said. "All right," he said. "We have a working arrangement. You're in the middle of a legal battle. She looked for the word. "I'm someone who shows up and fixes things and leaves. That's what I do. That's my whole life." "That's not who you are," he said. "That's what you've had to do." She opened her mouth and closed it. "There's a difference," he said, which was what she had said to Gideon about working versus having a job. And the fact that he was using her own logic back at her was both annoying and something else she didn't want to name. 8 days, she said. "What?" "I have 8 days left on our arrangement." He leaned against the stall post. "And after 8 days?" "I don't know," she said. It was the most honest thing she could have said, and they both knew it. Walt appeared at the far end of the barn with the particular timing of a man who had no idea he was interrupting anything and would be mortified to discover it later. "Caleb, rider coming up the road. Looks like it's from the land office." Caleb didn't move immediately. He was still looking at May. Then he straightened up. "I'll be right there," he said, and walked down the barn aisle, and May listened to his boots on the packed dirt floor until she couldn't hear them anymore. She looked down at the folded blanket in her arms. She was still holding it. The writer from the land office brought news that was, in the way of legal things, both better and worse than expected. Caleb's corrected ledgers had been formally submitted to the estate trustee. The trustee had acknowledged the error and revised the financial assessment of Broken Ridge upward, which was good. Gideon's attorney had responded within 48 hours with a new challenge, this one questioning not the finances but the management structure of the ranch itself, which was bad. May heard this from Walt, who had heard it from Pete, who had been near enough to the porch to catch most of the conversation. This was how information traveled on a small ranch, through proximity and repetition, like a game of telephone played by people who took their information seriously and tried to get it right. She found Caleb at the kitchen table that evening, with papers spread in front of him and a cup of coffee he had forgotten to drink. Edna was washing up, and the kitchen had the particular feeling of a room that had held a difficult conversation recently and hadn't fully recovered. "What's the new argument?" May asked, sitting down across from him. He looked up. He had the focused, tired look of someone doing long division in their head. "That I'm not actually running the ranch. That I'm dependent on an unverified outside party for operational decisions, which represents a management instability that makes me unfit to meet the estate requirements." May was quiet for a moment. "He's saying you're dependent on me." "He's saying the ranch is." Caleb turned a paper over. "Which is, look, it's not without some basis. You've done things in 3 weeks that I hadn't managed in 6 months. He can point to that and say Caleb Mercer can't run his own ranch. He needs this woman to run it for him." "That's not what happened," May said. "I know that. I've been working for you, reporting to you. Every decision I've made out here, I've run by you or Walt. I know that too." "Then, May," he set the paper down. "You know how legal arguments work. It doesn't have to be true. It has to be plausible. And to someone who doesn't know what actually happened here, it's plausible." She sat with that. It had the particular sting of things that were unfair in ways that were difficult to argue against. "What does your attorney say?" "He says we need to demonstrate continuity of management decisions from me, not from you. He says..." Caleb paused. "He says if we can show that the operational improvements on the ranch were directed by me and carried out by staff rather than initiated independently by you, the argument loses most of its traction." "But that's not what happened." "No," he said. "It's not." He said it in a way that meant he was not going to lie about it, and she felt something in her chest that was the specific feeling of a man's integrity landing on you when you were already carrying a lot. "There's a hearing," he said. "August 14th. Gideon's attorney has requested a formal county review of the estate conditions. They'll assess whether I'm meeting the stability requirements." He looked at her steadily. "I need you there." "As what?" "As a witness. As someone who can tell them what actually happened on this ranch in the last 3 weeks. The work you found, the decisions you documented, the ledger error." He picked up the coffee, looked at it, put it back down without drinking it. "I could try to argue it without you. My attorney says we have a case on the financials alone, but Gideon will put someone on that stand who'll say I ran this ranch single-handed while you were in town dealing with lawyers," May said. "Yes. And your attorney can counter that, but it'll take time and cost money, both of which I have less of than I need." May turned her coffee cup on the table. "The hearing is August 14th. My 30 days end on August 3rd. The math was clear between them. So was what it implied. Caleb said nothing, which was, she had come to understand, his way of saying the thing he was not going to pressure her to do. "I'll be at the hearing," May said. "May, I'll be at the hearing," she said again. "I'm not going to walk away and let Gideon Mercer win on a technicality because I had an end date on a contract." She stood up. "I'll stay through the 14th. Same wage, same terms." He looked at her with that look again, the one she didn't have a name for, the one that lived in the complicated territory between gratitude and something more personal that neither of them had acknowledged out loud since the storage room. "You don't have to," he said. "No," she agreed. "I know." She picked up her cup. "Edna, is there more coffee?" "There's always more coffee," Edna said without turning from the basin. "The question is whether you want it or whether you're just looking for something to do with your hands." May thought about that. "Both," she admitted. Edna made the sound that wasn't quite a laugh. She poured the coffee. The trouble with Gideon arrived in a different form on the last Saturday of July, and it did not come quietly. He showed up in town, in Harlan's Creek, at Hankins' Diner, on a Saturday when half the county was in town for the weekly market and the other half was in Hankins eating lunch, with two of his associates and a set of opinions he apparently felt the community needed to hear. May was there by coincidence. She had driven the supply wagon in with Pete to pick up feed and a replacement part for the water pump, and she was loading bags at the general store when she heard her name, not addressed to her, said about her, Gideon's voice coming from the open door of Hankins, carrying the way it always did. "The woman has no legal standing in this county. No property, no permanent address, no connection to the Mercer estate except a job she talked her way into on a train platform. She's been coaching Caleb on how to present his finances to make the ranch look healthier than it is. I'm not saying she's dishonest," which was exactly what he was saying, and everyone in earshot knew it. "I'm saying the picture isn't what it looks like." Pete's head came up from the feedback. "Don't," May said. "He's saying you're—" "I heard what he said." She kept loading. "Keep going." "May, he's in there telling half the county." "He can tell the whole county," she said. "Stack the grain right, or it'll shift in the wagon." Pete stacked the grain, but his jaw was tight, and he kept looking toward the diner like a dog that wanted to bark and was being told to sit. Inside Hankins, Gideon was still talking. She could hear enough to track it, phrases about irregularities and legal standing and what the estate trustee would find if they looked closely. Around him, she could hear the quieter sounds of people eating and listening, which was worse in some ways than loud objection. Quiet listening meant they were taking it in, turning it over. Some of them would file it away and forget it. Some of them wouldn't. She finished loading the wagon. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment with the sounds of the town around her and the familiar stillness moving through her chest, the same one she'd felt at the train platform and in the south pasture, and in every moment where the right response was not the satisfying one. She went into Hankins' diner. Not to confront him, she went because she wanted a piece of pie, and this was still a public diner in a town she had as much right to eat in as Gideon Mercer. She sat at the counter, with her back to the room, and ordered the apple pie and a glass of water, and she was aware of the room's awareness of her in the same way you were aware of weather changing. Gideon went quiet when she walked in. Then, after a beat, he said, to his table, but audible to everyone, "Speak of the devil." "The apple pie here is better than it used to be," May said to the woman behind the counter, who was about 50 and had the expression of someone watching a hand of cards get played. "Did they change something?" The woman blinked. "Different apples this year, local orchard." "Makes a difference," May said. The room was very quiet. Gideon said, "Miss Holloway, you might as well join the conversation." "I'm eating my pie," May said. "It concerns you." "I know." She took a bite, chewed it. "Still going to finish the pie first." Someone in the room made a sound that was quickly converted into a cough. May did not look around. Gideon tried twice more. She let both attempts land on the floor without picking them up. By the time she finished her pie and left 2 coins on the counter, the energy in the room had shifted from tense to something else. Something that happened when people who expected a fight watched a person refuse to give one without once looking afraid of it. She walked out. On the sidewalk, she found 3 people from the market who had apparently drifted over at some point during the last 10 minutes. Mrs. Hankins herself, the blacksmith, and a rancher named Coulter, whose property adjoined the eastern edge of Broken Ridge. None of them said anything directly to her, but the blacksmith held the door to the supply store open as she passed, and Mrs. Hankins said, "You tell Edna I have extra preserves if she wants them." And Coulter gave her a nod that meant something, small things, the kind that moved like water, slow and quiet, and eventually shaping everything they touched. She drove the supply wagon back to Broken Ridge with Pete beside her talking too much the way he did when he was processing something. And she let him talk. And by the time they turned up the ranch road, he had come to the conclusion all by himself that May had handled it exactly right, which she thought was probably true, but would not have said to him directly because he needed to arrive at it on his own. That evening, she went to the storage room one more time. The two halves of the blanket were folded together on the shelf where she had put them. She had not been able to put them back in their separate places, which she had tried to do and found she couldn't. She stood in front of the shelf and looked at them without touching them. 8 years. He had woken up in a creek bed with smoke in his lungs and a broken leg, and he had looked for the person who put a blanket around him and found a yellow thread and nothing else. And he had kept that thread. She did not know why that particular detail had burrowed into her the way it had. Not the broken leg, not the fire, not the 8 years of not knowing. The thread. She stood in the storage room for a while. Then Caleb was in the doorway again, which was becoming a pattern, and she turned around before he could speak. "Did you know?" she said. He blinked. "Know what?" "When you hired me. After the platform. When you offered me the 30 days. She looked at him steadily. "You took my hand when everyone on that platform was laughing. I thought that was just decency. I thought that was just the kind of man you were." She gestured, a short gesture, toward the shelf. "Was any part of it?" "No," he said, and said it fast enough that it was clearly true. "I didn't. May, I had no idea. I have been looking at those sunflowers for 8 years and I didn't—" He stopped. "You don't look like what I imagined." "What did you imagine?" He was quiet for a moment. "Someone softer," he said. "That's not—" He seemed to be choosing words carefully. "I imagined someone who would have stayed, someone who would have been there when I woke up." "I had a job," she said. "I couldn't afford to lose it." "I know," he said. I'm not saying it as an accusation. I'm saying I imagined someone different because I needed to imagine someone, and I was wrong about what she looked like." He paused. "You were right, though. You were exactly right. You saved my life, and you kept moving because that was the only way you could survive, and that makes you exactly who you are." He looked at the shelf. "The blanket. I've taken that blanket out maybe 100 times, and I never once thought the person who made it—" He stopped. "Montana is not a large state in the way that matters. People cross the same ground all the time. But they don't usually end up at the same ranch," May said. "No," he agreed. "They usually don't." The evening light through the storage room's single high window was going amber and slow, and the sounds of the ranch at day's end were coming in, cattle settling, Pete doing final rounds, the particular creak that the big barn door made when Walt closed it for the night. "Caleb," May said. "Still here," he said. "I don't know how to do this," she said. Not helplessly, just plainly. The same plainness he used, the kind that she had learned from him without meaning to, or maybe the kind she'd always had and had just found a matching register for. "I've been moving my whole life. I've been someone who shows up and solves the problem and moves to the next problem. I don't know how to be the answer instead of the solution." He thought about that for a moment. "I think," he said slowly, "that might be the same thing." She looked at him. "An answer is what you get when you've been asking the right question long enough," he said. "I've been asking for a while." May Holloway had faced a wildfire at 22 and not been afraid. She had delivered heartbreak to a stranger on a public platform and not been embarrassed. She had stood in a diner while a man talked about her to a room full of people, and she had eaten her pie. Standing in a storage room in fading light, she found that something in her chest was doing something she was not fully prepared for. She picked up the folded blanket from the shelf and held it against her chest. 8 days, she said. "Still 8 days, he agreed. "A lot can happen," she said. "It already has," he said, and turned and walked back into the barn. And she stood there in the amber light with the blanket and the smell of old wood and the sounds of the ranch coming in around her, and she thought, "This is the first place I have ever stood that felt like I was supposed to be standing in it." She didn't know what to do with that. She was going to have to figure it out. The 7 days between the storage room and the August 14th hearing moved the way time moved when something large was coming, faster than you wanted in some hours, slower than you could bear in others. May did not stop working. That was not something she was capable of doing, and the ranch still needed it regardless of what was happening in courtrooms and attorneys' offices and the carefully managed conversations Gideon Mercer was conducting across the county. She finished the east fence line. She worked with Walt on rotating the cattle to fresher pasture. She spent 2 days helping Pete learn how to properly assess hoof condition on the older stock, because Pete was going to be here after the hearing regardless of how it went, and his education was not dependent on the outcome of anything legal. She and Caleb existed in the same space during those 7 days in a way that was different from the first 3 weeks. Nothing had been said directly. Nothing had been decided. But the storage room had changed the acoustic properties of the air between them. Every conversation now had a second conversation underneath it that neither of them was quite ready to surface, and they both knew it, and they were both, in their different ways, afraid to push it before the hearing because the hearing was the thing that mattered, and everything else had to wait its turn. Gideon filed one more challenge in that week, a procedural motion that Caleb's attorney called predictable, and May called what it was, which was interference. It added 2 hours of work to an already overburdened attorney and cost Caleb money he had calculated 3 different ways trying to determine whether he had it. He did, barely. The corrected ledgers had given him just enough ground to stand on. The night before the hearing, May sat on the bunkhouse steps in the cooling dark and thought about testimony. She had spoken in formal settings before, a ranch dispute in Wyoming, an employment disagreement in Idaho that had gone further than it should have before the other party backed down. She knew how to present information clearly. She was not afraid of rooms or of being looked at. What she was thinking about was something different, the specific question of how to tell the truth about the last 24 days on Broken Ridge Ranch in a way that was accurate and complete and did not, in the process, give Gideon's argument any additional material to work with. The problem was that the truth was complicated. The truth included finding the ledger error, yes. The truth included the fence work and the drainage assessment and the sick calf and the documented decisions. All of that was clean and presentable and accurate. The truth also included a half-burned saddle blanket on a storage room shelf. The truth included a man keeping a yellow thread for 8 years. The truth included standing in amber light and saying, "I don't know how to do this," and meaning something large and uncertain and not yet resolved. A good attorney on the other side, and Gideon's attorney was technically competent, whatever else he was, would take that unresolved thing and use it, would say, "See, this is what I told you. This is not an employee-employer relationship. This is something else, something irregular, something that clouds the legitimacy of the whole arrangement." She was still sitting there thinking it through when Caleb came and sat on the step below hers. He had his hat off, and his hair was doing the thing it did at the end of long days, which was not quite presentable, and he had a piece of rope in his hands that he was working through a knot in, not because the knot needed working, she suspected, but because he needed something to do with his hands. "You couldn't sleep either," she said. "Didn't try yet." He got one part of the knot loose and started on another. "What are you thinking about?" "Testimony," she said. "And?" "And what I say when they ask me about my relationship with you." He was quiet for a moment, working the rope. "What will you say?" "I'll say I was hired as a ranch hand, which is true." She looked at the dark yard. "I'll say all decisions were made in consultation with you, which is also true." She paused. "I won't volunteer anything that isn't directly asked." "That's good strategy," he said. "It's not strategy," she said. "It's just how I handle things." He looked up at her. In the dark, he was mostly outline and the glint of eyes. "May, did I ask you something and get an honest answer? When have I given you anything else?" "Fair point." He set the rope down. "If the hearing goes badly tomorrow, if Gideon wins the procedural argument and the trustee moves against the estate, if I lose the ranch." He said it the way he said everything, plain, without performing the weight of it. "What do you do?" She thought about that. "I get back on a train," she said. "I find the next ranch. I do the next job." She paused. "That's what I've always done." "Is that what you want to do?" The question sat in the air between them. "It's not about what I want," she said, more out of habit than conviction, and she heard it as she said it and knew it wasn't quite honest, which was uncomfortable. "I think it might be," he said quietly. She looked at the dark outline of the barn against the sky. "I have had, in my life, exactly one person tell me that what I wanted mattered," she said. "My grandmother. She died when I was 25. Since then, I have mostly operated on the assumption that what I want and what the situation requires are the same question, because it's easier to function that way." He was listening in that particular way of his that meant he was not preparing his response while she was talking. He was actually listening. This ranch, she said slowly. This specific place. She stopped. Tell me, he said. I've worked 9 ranches in 12 years, she said. I know what a temporary place feels like. I know what it's like to work somewhere and feel the whole time like you're a visiting piece in the wrong puzzle. She turned the coffee cup she'd brought out and forgotten about. I don't feel like that here. I don't know what to do with that. I have never not known what to do with that. He picked up the rope again, just holding it this time rather than working it. The offer I haven't made yet, he said, because I was waiting for the hearing and because I didn't want you to feel, I didn't want it to be about obligation or the legal situation or anything except what it actually is. He stopped, restarted. I would like you to stay, past the hearing, past any deadline or legal requirement or date on a contract. He said it with the same plainness as everything else, but his hands were not still on the rope. Not as a ranch hand. Caleb, not asking you to decide tonight, he said. I'm asking you to know that the offer exists, so that when you stand up in that courtroom tomorrow and testify, you're not deciding it then. That decision is separate. She sat with that for a long time. Okay, she said. Okay? Okay, I know the offer exists, she said. I'll deal with it after the hearing. He nodded, picked up his hat, stood. Get some sleep if you can. You too, she said. He went back to the house. May sat on the step for another 20 minutes, listening to the cattle and the wind and the sound of a ranch that felt like somewhere she had been before. And then she went inside and lay down and stared at the ceiling and did not sleep for a considerable time. She was not thinking about the hearing. She was thinking about a yellow thread. The county courthouse in Harlan's Creek was a building that took itself seriously in the way of small-town official buildings, all dark wood and deliberate solidity, as if the architecture itself was meant to signal that things decided here would hold. The hearing room held maybe 60 people. By 9 in the morning on August 14th, it held roughly 55, which was nearly every person in the county who could arrange transport on a weekday. May noticed that when she came in with Caleb and his attorney, a gray-haired, efficient man named Aldous Fitch, who had been practicing in this county for 30 years and who Gideon's attorney visibly disliked, which May read as a good sign. She noticed the faces turned toward them, and she noticed the mix in those faces. Some neutral, some already decided one way or another. Some just there because it was the most interesting thing happening in Harlan's Creek in months. She saw Edna Briggs in the back row, sitting with her hands folded and her expression that of a woman who had lived through a great deal and was prepared to live through more. She saw Walt and Pete near the side wall, both in their better shirts. She saw, in the front row on the opposite side of the aisle, Gideon Mercer in his best coat, beside his attorney, beside 2 men she didn't recognize who were presumably witnesses. Gideon caught her eye when she sat down. He gave her the small, precise nod of a man who considers himself to be in a superior position. May looked away without returning it. The hearing opened with procedural matters that Aldous Fitch navigated with the economy of long practice. The estate trustee's representative, a humorless man from Billings named Garrett, who clearly wished he were somewhere else, sat at a separate table to the side and took notes with the expression of someone compiling information rather than forming opinions. Gideon's attorney went first. His name was Pendleton, and he was younger than Fitch by about 20 years and more polished by about the same amount. He presented the challenge in organized segments: the financial history of the ranch, the management instability argument, and what he called the irregularity of the current operational arrangement. He was thorough. He had documentation. He spoke with the confidence of someone who had done this before and expected to do it again. His first witness was a land assessor who testified about the original financial picture of Broken Ridge, the figures from the flawed ledgers, the ones that showed the ranch hemorrhaging money. Aldous Fitch cross-examined him briefly and introduced the corrected documentation, and the assessor conceded that the revised numbers were more accurate, and that was mostly that on the financial argument, though Pendleton managed to get a few more questions in about the consistency of the bookkeeping that planted seeds he clearly intended to water later. His second witness was a man named Croft, who owned a neighboring property and who testified that in his observation, Caleb Mercer had been absent from the physical operations of the ranch for significant stretches during the past year due to legal proceedings, and that in his view the ranch had been running below acceptable standards for the inheritance requirements. Fitch cross-examined. Mr. Croft, when did you last visit Broken Ridge Ranch? I ride that road regular. When did you last set foot on the property? A pause. Sometime in the spring. The fence line along your shared boundary. Have you noticed any change in its condition in recent weeks? Another pause. It's in better shape than it was. Thank you, Fitch said. Then Gideon himself took the stand. Gideon was, May had to admit, a very good witness for himself. He spoke with genuine feeling about his late uncle's wishes for the ranch, about his concern for the estate's integrity, about his deep and personal interest in seeing Broken Ridge continue as his family's legacy. He managed to frame every act of interference and manipulation as a motivated, principled attempt to protect something he loved. He was convincing, and the room could feel the sincerity in it, or the performance of sincerity, which in the moment was functionally identical. When he got to May, he was careful. I have nothing against Miss Holloway personally, he said. She appears to be a hard worker, but the question isn't about her character. It's about the structural integrity of the management. Caleb brought this woman on in a moment of personal vulnerability, following a difficult situation at the train station. He brought her on without vetting, without documentation, without reference checks. She's been making operational decisions on a ranch that has legal requirements attached to its management structure. That's not a personal judgment, that's a fact. Fitch stood up. Miss Holloway documented every decision with written notes submitted to Mr. Mercer for review. Is that the practice of someone operating independently? That was apparently added later, Gideon said smoothly, after the situation was called into question. It was a good lie. It sounded plausible. May felt it land in the room. Pendleton finished with Gideon and sat down. Garrett, the trustee's man, made more notes. Then Aldous Fitch stood up and said, I'd like to call Caleb Mercer. Caleb took the stand the way he did most things, without ceremony, without apparent nerves, with the quality of a man who had decided to do something and was simply doing it. Fitch walked him through the establishment of the ranch's management structure, through the ledger correction, through the specific nature of May's employment and her documented reports to Caleb. It was solid testimony, organized and clear. Caleb answered every question directly, without embellishment, without the tendency some people had to over-explain when they felt defensive. Then Fitch asked, Mr. Mercer, can you tell the court how Miss Holloway came to be employed at Broken Ridge Ranch? Caleb looked at the room for a moment. Not at his attorney, not at Gideon, just the room. The woman I'd been corresponding with for a year didn't come, he said. She sent someone to tell me in person instead of just not showing up. I thought that was a decent thing to do, and the person she sent was May Holloway. He paused. Miss Holloway had skills I needed. She was honest with me from the first minute I talked to her, which was more than I was getting from several other quarters. I offered her 30 days of work at fair wage. She accepted. And the nature of the work, she reported to me, Caleb said. Every decision, every assessment. I have her written notes, which she started on day one, not after any challenge was filed. I have testimony from my ranch hands and my housekeeper about how decisions were made and who made them. He looked at Garrett, the trustee's man. She saved a calf that would have died. She found a financial error in my books that had been misrepresenting this ranch's viability for 18 months. She repaired fencing that had been deteriorating since winter. He paused. I made every significant decision about this property. She gave me the information and the work that made those decisions possible. That's what a good ranch hand does. Mr. Mercer, Fitch said, is there anything else you'd like the court to understand about the situation at Broken Ridge? Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Yes. Fitch looked slightly uncertain, which meant this was not part of what they had prepared, and May sat up straighter in her seat. 8 years ago, Caleb said, there was a fire in this county. Prairie Fire, July of 1877. I was caught in it. My horse went down and I was trapped and I was going to die there. And a woman I had never met before in my life freed me from a dead horse and carried me to a creek bed with the fire cutting 20 feet away on both sides. He said it without performance, without drama. The room was absolutely silent. She wrapped me in her blanket because I was in shock and she had to keep moving. I never knew her name. I never knew if she survived. I kept looking for her for years and I never found her because she was the kind of person who solves the problem and moves to the next one and doesn't stay to be thanked. Pendleton was on his feet. Your Honor, I fail to see the relevance. The relevance, Caleb said, still in that same even voice, is that May Holloway is that woman. The blanket she left with me and the blanket she's been carrying for 12 years are the same blanket. I have both halves in this room if the court wants to see them. He looked at Garrett. The woman my cousin is calling an unvetted drifter saved my life before she ever set foot on my ranch. She came to Broken Ridge carrying someone else's bad news, asked for nothing, earned everything she got, and has operated with more integrity than anyone else I've encountered in this entire legal process. He looked at Gideon. Including my own family. The room did not erupt. It wasn't that kind of room, and it wasn't that kind of crowd. But the sound that moved through it was the sound of 60 people recalibrating everything they thought they knew. May became aware that her hands were very still in her lap. She had not known he was going to say that. Pendleton was arguing procedure with Fitch in low, urgent tones. The judge, a weathered man named Harcastle, who had the look of someone who had presided over a great deal and was rarely surprised by any of it, waited for them to finish with the patience of a person who had learned it was more efficient to let things run out than to interrupt them. Then he said, "Mr. Pendleton, objection noted. The testimony stands. Mr. Fitch, do you have additional witnesses?" "One," Fitch said. "I'd like to call May Holloway." She walked to the stand with the particular stillness that came when everything inside her was very loud, and she had learned, over a lifetime, to not let that show. She stated her name, her age, her years of experience. Fitch walked her through her work history, through the specific tasks at Broken Ridge, through the documentation process she had used from day one. She answered every question precisely, without extra words, without hedging. Then Fitch said, "Miss Holloway, my opposing counsel has characterized your presence at Broken Ridge Ranch as that of an unvetted individual who arrived under irregular circumstances and has been making operational decisions outside any legitimate management structure. How would you respond to that characterization?" May looked at Pendleton, then at Gideon, then at Garrett, who was still taking notes. "I would say that the word irregular is doing a lot of work in that sentence," she said. One person in the back of the room made a sound that was definitely a laugh, quickly contained. "The circumstances were unusual," May continued. "A woman I met at a coach station was distressed and asked me to deliver a message for her, and I did. When I arrived, Caleb Mercer was short-handed, and I had the skills he needed. He offered me a job. I took it." She looked at Garrett directly. "I have been a ranch hand for 12 years. I have worked for 9 different operations. In every one of those situations, I found problems that weren't being addressed, and I brought them to the attention of whoever I was working for. That's not independent decision-making. That's being competent at a job." Fitch said, "Miss Holloway, is it true that all operational recommendations you made during your time at Broken Ridge were submitted to Caleb Mercer for review and approval?" "Every single one," she said, "in writing, from day one." "And who initiated that documentation practice?" "I did," she said, "because I work for someone else's property. You document everything when you work for someone else's property. That's basic." Fitch nodded. He paused, which meant he was about to say something he had decided to say at the last minute. "Miss Holloway, why did you agree to extend your arrangement past your original 30-day contract to be present for this hearing?" She had expected other questions. Not that one. She looked at the room, at Edna in the back row, at Walt and Pete against the wall, at Caleb sitting at the table with his hands still, at Gideon whose precise smile had gone slightly fixed. "It would have been wrong to leave," she said. "Can you elaborate?" She thought about it. "I came to this ranch carrying someone else's disappointment," she said. "And instead of being sent away, I was offered honest work. And instead of taking that work for what I could get out of it, I found that the place needed more than I'd planned to give, and I gave it." She paused. "And then someone tried to use the fact that I'd given it against the man I was working for, and I wasn't willing to let that stand. So I stayed." She looked at the judge. "That's not an irregular arrangement. That's just being a decent person." The room was quiet again. Pendleton cross-examined her for 15 minutes. He was competent and methodical, and he found no inconsistencies because there were none to find. She answered everything the same way she'd answered it for Fitch, directly, without decoration, without giving him anything to work with that wasn't already in the record. When he was done, she started to rise from the stand. The judge said, "Miss Holloway, one moment." She waited. In your 12 years of working ranches, he said, studying her with the particular attention of a man who had been listening very carefully, have you ever encountered a situation where an estate legal challenge was being used to pressure an owner into a management decision they would not otherwise have made? Pendleton was on his feet again. Your Honor, the witness isn't being asked to— I'm asking the question, Mr. Pendleton. Hardcastle did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. Miss Holloway? May looked at him. Once, she said, in Idaho, 3 years ago. Different family, similar pattern, one relative with a legal challenge that looked legitimate on paper and wasn't, and a lot of filing fees and attorney's bills that made the operation look weaker than it was. She paused. The ranch survived. The relative eventually stopped. What made the difference? The owner stopped trying to manage how it looked, she said, and started just telling the truth about what was actually happening. She glanced at Caleb. That's harder than it sounds. Hardcastle made a note. You may step down. The judge took 40 minutes. May spent them outside on the courthouse steps because she could not sit in the room and wait, and she was not willing to stand against the wall looking like she was managing something. She sat on the top step with her back straight and her hands in her lap and watched the road and listened to the sounds of a small Montana town going about its Tuesday. Edna came out at the 20-minute mark and sat beside her without asking whether she wanted company. They sat in silence for a while. He's going to win, Edna said. Not hopeful, just stating something she'd assessed. I think so, May said. Gideon will file again. Probably. Caleb's attorney says there are limits to how many times the same challenge can be. I know, May said. I talked to Fitch. More silence. You're thinking about the offer, Edna said. May looked at her. He told you. He didn't have to, Edna said. I've been in that house for 30 years. I know what a man looks like when he's trying to figure out how to say the most important thing he's ever said. She folded her hands on her knee. He asked me once, when he was about 20, what the difference was between being lonely and being alone. I told him one was a condition and one was a choice. He said he didn't understand. She paused. He does now. May looked at the road. I've been alone my whole life, May said. By condition and by choice both. I don't know which was which anymore. Might not matter, Edna said. Both can change. The courthouse door opened. Fitch appeared, and behind him Walt, and behind Walt Pete, who could not contain himself and said, too loudly, He won! Before Walt grabbed his arm and gave him a look that required no words. May stood up. She turned around. Caleb was coming through the door with the specific expression of a man who has just been told something large and is carrying it carefully because he's not sure yet how fragile it is. He saw her on the steps. The judge had dismissed every challenge, had cited the corrected financial documentation, the testimonies of both Caleb and May, and what he had called, according to Pete, who was not the most reliable reporter but was usually accurate about the things that mattered, a clear demonstration of the authentic character of the operation and the integrity of all parties involved. He had addressed Gideon's attorney specifically regarding future procedural filings, in terms that Fitch had described to Walt as unusually direct for Judge Hardcastle. Gideon himself had left the room before the ruling finished. All of that information reached May in pieces, from Pete and Walt and Fitch as they filed out around Caleb. She registered it, filed it, and kept looking at Caleb, who had stopped 3 feet away from her on the courthouse steps, and was looking back at her with the look she still didn't have a name for, and was beginning to think she might need one. Well, she said. Well, he said. You told them about the fire, she said. I did. That wasn't— I didn't know you were going to do that. I know, he said. I decided it on the stand. He paused. I decided that if I was going to stand up in a courtroom and ask people to believe I was running my ranch with integrity, I was going to tell them everything that was actually true, including the part that was harder to say. The blanket, she said. And the thread, he said. I didn't mention the thread, thought that might be a step too far for a county courthouse. Something in her chest did the thing again. The thing she had been trying to name for days and had thus far managed to avoid fully identifying. I have an offer, she said, from a ranch outside Billings. Came in 2 weeks ago. They need a manager. Real salary, year-round, housing included. I've been— I wrote back that I was committed through August 14th and I'd reply after. He was very still. It's a good offer, she said. I know, he said, though he didn't, and she knew he didn't, and she had said it anyway because she needed to say the hard thing out loud first before she got to the other thing. Caleb, she said, I have spent my whole life walking through the right door at the wrong time, or the wrong door at the right time. I'm standing in front of your courthouse, and I have been on your ranch for 24 days, and I found half my blanket in your storage room, and you kept a yellow thread for 8 years, and I don't know how to do this. I told you that. I meant it. She looked at him steadily. But I know that if I get on a train to Billings, I'm going to spend the rest of my life thinking about this specific set of steps and this specific man standing on them. He exhaled. It was not a dramatic exhale. It was the exhale of a man who has been holding something for a long time. Stay, he said. Not for the ranch, not for any legal reason or practical reason, because I have been looking for the person who left a blanket in a creek bed for 8 years, and she showed up carrying someone else's broken engagement, and she fixed my fence and found my mistake in the ledger and sat in a diner and ate pie while my cousin talked about her like she wasn't there. He stopped, started again. Stay, because this is where you belong. I know that's a lot to say. I'm saying it anyway. May stood on the courthouse steps in Harlan's Creek, Montana, on August 14th, 1885, with the sun at 10 o'clock and the road dusty and Edna Briggs pretending not to listen 15 feet away, and she thought about trains and blankets and yellow threads and a calf that had lived and a fence that was fixed and a kitchen that smelled like dried apples and a man who thanked people plainly and meant every word. I'm going to write to the ranch in Billings and decline their offer, she said. He waited. And then, she said, we're going to have a very long conversation about what happens next, because I am not a person who does things without talking them through first, and there is a lot to talk through. I have time, he said. You'd better, she said. She walked down one step so they were at the same level, and she held out her hand. He looked at it. Then he did what he had done on a train platform 24 days ago, when everyone was laughing and she was standing alone with a sealed letter. He took her hand, not the handshake of an employer, not a formal gesture, just two people holding on. Pete, from somewhere behind them, made a sound of profound satisfaction. Walt told him to hush. May did not let go. The ride back from the courthouse was quieter than the ride in had been, which was not the same as peaceful. Pete talked enough for everyone, which was his way of processing things. A running commentary on the hearing, on the judge's expression when Gideon's attorney tried to object the third time, on the specific moment when he personally had known it was going to go their way, which he placed at different points in the proceedings each time he told it. Walt let him talk and said almost nothing, which was also his way. Edna rode in the wagon with her hands folded and her eyes on the road ahead, and once, when she thought no one was watching, she closed them briefly in a way that was not sleep. May rode beside Caleb on horseback. They did not talk much on the road. There was too much to say for a road, and they both knew it, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable the way silences could be. It was the silence of two people who have said the large thing and are now in the space between saying it and living with it, which is a different kind of space than either the before or the after. When they turned up the ranch road and Broken Ridge came into view over the rise, May felt it again, that specific quality of arriving somewhere that felt like recognition rather than arrival. She had tried to examine that feeling several times in the past weeks and had not fully made sense of it, and she had mostly concluded that some things were not better understood by examination and were best left to exist the way they were. The ranch looked the same as it always did from the road. The main house with its peeling paint that she had put on a list, the barn with its repaired roof section, the fence line along the east side standing straight and solid in the afternoon light. The same and also different, the way a place could change simply because the person looking at it had changed. Caleb unsaddled his horse in the barn while May did the same, and for a while there was just the sound of tack coming off, and horses going into their stalls, and the barn settling around them, and it was ordinary in a way that felt, after the formality of the courthouse, almost startling. You should eat something, May said. You didn't eat this morning. Neither did you. I noticed that about 20 minutes into the hearing, she admitted. He made a sound that was closer to a real laugh than she'd heard from him in days. Edna will feed us before we ask. She already has the kitchen going, May said. I could smell it from the yard. They walked out of the barn into the late afternoon and across the yard, and May stopped at the water pump to wash her hands, and the normalcy of it, the cold water, the grit coming off, the ordinary end of an extraordinary day, settled into her like something her body had been waiting for. That very long conversation she had promised him started over supper, which Edna served and then removed herself from, with the tact of a woman who understood exactly when her presence was and wasn't needed. Pete and Danny ate in the bunkhouse. Walt took a plate and went to sit on the fence by the south pasture, which was something he did when he was thinking, and May had learned not to interrupt it. So it was just the two of them at the kitchen table, with Edna's roast and yesterday's bread and the oil lamp turned up against the coming dark, and May put her fork down after the first few minutes and said, "Ask me what you want to ask me." Caleb looked up. "What makes you think I have a specific question?" "You've been composing it since the courthouse steps," she said. "I can tell." He set his fork down too, which she noted. "What does staying actually mean to you?" he said. "Not what it means in terms of the ranch or the legal situation. What does it mean to you for yourself?" It was a good question. It was the question she had been asking herself in various forms since the storage room, and she had not yet found an answer that was both honest and complete. "It means I stopped moving," she said. "That's the simple version, and it's not the whole version." She looked at the table. "I've been moving since I was 22. After my grandmother died, there was nothing holding me to any particular place, and I found that I was good at it. The moving, at being the person who comes in and solves the problem and leaves before the next problem arrives." She paused. "What I didn't let myself think about, because it wasn't useful to think about, was what I was leaving every time I left." "What were you leaving?" "I don't know yet," she said. "I think that's the honest answer. I know what I was arriving at every time. A new problem, a new set of hands I had to earn the respect of, a new piece of land that needed something I could give it. I got good at arrivals." She looked at him. "I've never been good at staying. I don't know if I know how." "I don't know if staying is a skill," he said. "I think it might just be a decision you keep making." She considered that. "Every day?" "Every day you're not on a train," he said, with the dry thing that lived next door to his humor. "That's my understanding of it." She picked her fork back up. "That's either very simple or very hard." "Both," he said. "Mostly both." They ate. The lamp made its small circle of light. Outside, the ranch did what ranches did at night, settled into its sounds, the cattle and the wind and the particular creak of the big barn door that she had learned to read as the last sound of the working day. "I need to write to Billings tonight," she said. "You don't have to do it tonight." "I do," she said. "Because if I don't do it tonight, I'll spend the next week talking myself in and out of it, and that's not fair to them or to you or to me." She paused. "I'm not good at uncertain. I'm better at decided." He nodded. "Write the letter." "I'm also going to need to renegotiate my wage," she said. He blinked. "Renegotiate." "If I'm staying past the hearing, past any temporary arrangement, as a permanent operational manager of this ranch, rather than a day wage hand, the terms need to reflect that." She met his eyes without apology. "I'm not working for gratitude and proximity, Caleb. I need a real arrangement in writing." For a moment his expression was unreadable. Then it resolved into something that was definitely the real laugh this time. "You just got off the courthouse steps holding my hand, and the second thing you said was about wage renegotiation." "The first thing was about the very long conversation," she said. "The conversation includes the wage." "All right," he said. "We'll work it out." "In writing." "In writing," he agreed. "May, I wasn't going to offer you less than you're worth." "I know," she said. "But I've seen enough handshake arrangements go sideways to know that being worth something and being paid accordingly are two different discussions, and one of them needs paper." He looked at her with that expression, the one that wasn't quite gratitude and wasn't quite wonder, the one that had no name. "You are the most practical woman I have ever met," he said. "I've had to be," she said. "I know." He said it the same way he'd said things all along, plainly, without putting anything extra on it. "For what it's worth. That's going to be different here. It doesn't have to be a survival mechanism anymore." She heard that. She let it in carefully, the way you let light in when you've been in a dark room long enough that you needed to give your eyes time to adjust. "Let's start with the wage," she said. "We'll work up to the rest." She wrote the letter to Billings after supper, at the kitchen table with a good lamp and Edna's pen, which wrote better than her own. It was not a long letter. She thanked them for the offer, said she had made other arrangements, wished them well in finding the right manager. Clean, complete, no door left open. She sealed it and set it on the table to go with the morning post. Then she sat with the sealed envelope for a while. She was not second-guessing it. She had learned to know the difference between second-guessing and simply sitting with a large decision long enough to understand its full shape. This was the second thing. The decision was made. She was just acknowledging what it meant. 12 years of moving, 9 ranches, somewhere between 200 and 300 nights in bunkhouses that were not hers, eating at tables that were not hers, fixing problems on land that was not hers, and then leaving when the fixing was done. She had been good at that life. She had made it work. But she could not say honestly that it had been the life she would have designed if anyone had offered her the option of designing one. She had never thought anyone would. She picked up the envelope and walked it to the front table by the door where the outgoing mail went, and set it down, and that was that. Gideon Mercer did not surrender immediately, because men like Gideon Mercer rarely did. Surrender required admitting that you had been trying to take something that wasn't yours, and that kind of admission did not come easy to someone who had spent his whole life constructing reasons why the thing he wanted was rightfully his. He filed one more motion, 11 days after the hearing. May found out about it the way she found out about most things, from Walt, who had heard from Pete, who had been near the post when the writer came. She went to Caleb's office and knocked, and he was already on the telephone with Fitch, his expression doing the controlled thing it did when he was managing frustration that he did not intend to perform for anyone. She sat in the chair across from his desk and waited. When he hung up, he said, "He's challenging the hearing outcome on procedural grounds. He says the judge overstepped in asking you questions from the bench." "Did he?" "Fitch says no. Fitch says it's a long shot, and Pendleton probably knows it's a long shot, but Gideon doesn't let things go easily." May looked at the wall behind Caleb's desk, where he had put up the corrected ledger summary in a frame. Not for pride, she thought, but because it was a reminder of how close things had come to going wrong. "What does Fitch recommend?" "Let it play out. He says it won't get a hearing date before the estate deadline at the end of September, which means even if it proceeds, the inheritance conditions will have been met before any new ruling could affect them." "And after September 30th? "After September 30th, the ranch is fully mine under the estate conditions. The basis for most of Gideon's challenges disappears." He looked at her. He could still try to contest the inheritance itself, but Fitch says the grounds are thin and getting thinner. May nodded. "So we wait." "We work," he said, "and we wait." That was what they did. The 6 weeks between the hearing and the September 30th deadline were, in some ways, the hardest and in other ways the straightforward of all. Hard because Gideon's continued presence on the legal horizon meant that nothing felt fully resolved. Straightforward because the ranch needed work regardless of what was happening in courtrooms, and work was something May knew how to do without being asked. She and Caleb worked out the formal arrangement on paper, with Fitch reviewing it, one evening at the kitchen table. Real numbers, real responsibilities. Her name on a document that named her operational manager of Broken Ridge Ranch. She read every line twice before she signed it, which she had explained to Caleb was not distrust. It was habit, and the habit had saved her before, and she saw no reason to stop now. He said he would have been concerned if she hadn't. She signed the paper. He signed below her. Edna witnessed it, and then made the sound that wasn't quite a laugh, and then made pie, which was becoming May's understanding of how Edna expressed the larger emotions. The work in those 6 weeks was real and constant, and she was glad of it. She brought in 2 additional hands, a woman named Rosa who had done cattle work in New Mexico and came with references. May checked personally, and an older man named Birch who knew draft horses the way some people knew languages, fluently and from early childhood. The ranch expanded its operational capacity in ways that the corrected ledger showed it could afford, and May kept every receipt and documented every decision and put it all in order in the ledger system that she rebuilt from the base up so that the error that had nearly cost Caleb everything could not happen again. She fixed the peeling paint on the main house. Not alone, Pete helped on weekends, and Danny turned out to have a better eye for it than he had expected, and by the middle of September the house looked like what it was, which was a solid piece of well-maintained property that someone lived in and cared about. Caleb watched her oversee the painting from the porch one Sunday afternoon and said, "You didn't have to do that." It was on my list, she said. You have a list. I have several lists, she said. You should see them sometime. It would either reassure you or frighten you. Which do you think? Both, she said. Mostly both. He smiled at that. A real one, the kind that took his whole face, which she had learned was rarer than the almost smiles and meant more for it. The very long conversation she had promised continued, in pieces, the way conversations did when people were also working and living and managing both a ranch and the complicated new geography of being two people who had decided something large. It was not a smooth process. May was direct to a degree that occasionally required Caleb to take a breath before responding. Caleb had a tendency to go quiet when things got hard rather than saying the difficult thing out loud, which required May to wait longer than felt natural and then ask directly, which was not her preference, but which she did because the alternative was a silence that didn't resolve. They disagreed about the South Pasture drainage project. She wanted to do it before winter. He thought the cost timing was wrong. They argued about it for 2 days, not badly, but genuinely, and in the end they found a middle approach that was probably better than either of their original positions, which May filed away as evidence that disagreement, done right, was not the opposite of cooperation. She told him that. He said he'd been raised to avoid conflict, and he knew it wasn't always the right instinct, and he was working on it. She said she'd been raised by a woman who said what she meant, and expected you to do the same, and she knew that wasn't always comfortable for people who hadn't been, and she was also working on it. We're both works in progress, he said. Most people are, she said. The ones who think they're finished are the ones to watch out for. He thought about that. Like Gideon. Exactly like Gideon, she said. Us. September 30th arrived on a clear day with the particular quality of late Montana fall. Cold mornings, warm afternoons, the light coming in at an angle that made everything look like the last good version of itself before winter. Nothing dramatic happened. That was the thing about deadlines when you had spent 6 weeks making sure you were ready for them. They arrived, and the work was there, and the numbers were right, and the papers were in order, and the estate trustee's representative, a different one this time, a younger man who seemed more interested in the actual facts than Garrett had been, came out to the ranch in the morning, looked at everything Fitch presented to him, asked May 3 questions about the operational records, and told Caleb by early afternoon that Broken Ridge Ranch had met every condition of the inheritance requirement. Caleb thanked him. The man left. Caleb came and found May in the far north pasture, where she was checking on the new fence section Rosa had put up the week before. He rode up and stopped, and she looked at the expression on his face and said, "It's done?" "It's done," he said. She looked at the fence, clean posts, good wire tension, properly grounded at the corners. "Rosa does good work," she said. "May." She looked at him. "It's done," he said again, and this time it meant something different, and she understood both meanings. She pulled on the top wire to test the tension. Perfect. "Yes," she said, "it is." They rode back to the ranch together, and that evening Edna made the largest supper May had seen since arriving. Not because anyone had asked her to, but because Edna Briggs had been keeping this ranch running for 30 years, and she knew what a thing worth celebrating looked like, and she was not going to let it pass unmarked. Pete and Danny and Walt and Rosa and Birch all ate at the main house table, which hadn't happened before. Edna sat at the end of the table and did not pretend she wasn't pleased about any of it. May sat beside Caleb, and at some point during the meal, his hand found hers under the table, and she did not pull away, and that was a quiet thing that nobody else saw, and that was between exactly the two people it was between. Gideon's final motion was formally dismissed 2 weeks later, on a date in October that May noted and then set aside. Fitch sent the paperwork. Caleb read it, put it in the file, and went back to work. That was the end of Gideon Mercer as an active presence in their lives. Not a dramatic ending, not a confrontation or a scene, just a man running out of legal mechanisms and eventually out of the particular energy that drives people who are trying to take what isn't theirs. He left the county sometime before Christmas. May heard it mentioned once in passing in town and did not ask for details. She had more interesting things to think about. Caleb asked her to marry him under the old cottonwood tree on the north edge of the property, on his birthday in November, which was also the first heavy frost of the year. It was not a romantic setting in any conventional sense. They had ridden out to check the north fence after a cold night, And the frost had done what frost did to the ground and the grass and the fence wire, and Caleb stopped his horse under the cottonwood and May stopped beside him, and they looked at the land, their land, though they hadn't said it exactly that way yet. And he said, without preamble, "I want to ask you something." "You've been composing it again," she said. "Since yesterday," he admitted. "Ask." He looked at her steadily, his breath visible in the cold air, his horse patient beneath him the way horses were when riders went still. "Stay," he said. "Not as a manager. Not under any contract or arrangement or legal document." He paused. "Stay as my wife, as my partner, as the person who runs this ranch beside me for however long we have." He stopped. "I know that's a large thing. I know you didn't come here for it. I know you came here by accident, delivering someone else's bad news, and I know that—" "Yes," she said. He stopped. "You didn't let me finish." "I know," she said. "Yes, anyway." He looked at her. The frost was in his hair and on his coat collar, and he looked, she thought, like the most honest person she had ever met in a life that had contained a great many people, and very few of them honest in quite this particular way. "That's it?" he said. "That's it," she said. "Were you expecting more?" "I had 4 more sentences," he said. "Save them," she said. "You can tell me what they were later. I want to check this fence before the ground gets any harder." He laughed. Not the almost laugh. The real one, the full-face one, out here in the frost under the cottonwood with the land spread around them and the cold air carrying it away into the clear November sky. "All right," he said. "Fence first." They married 3 weeks later, on a Saturday, at the ranch, with exactly the people who had earned the right to be there. Edna, Walt, Pete, Danny, Rosa, Birch, Aldous Fitch, and his wife, the blacksmith from Harlan's Creek, who had held a door open for her once and meant something by it, and Mrs. Hankins, who brought dried apple pie and placed it on the table with the authority of someone who had decided this was their contribution and no one was going to tell them otherwise. It was cold. The fire inside was good, and the food was better, and Pete cried, which he would deny for the rest of his life. And Walt shook Caleb's hand for a long time in the way of men who do not have the words for what they want to say and use the grip to say it instead. May wore her good shirt and her best boots and the lariat on her hip because it was hers, and she did not stop being who she was because she was also becoming something new. She had told Caleb this beforehand, about the lariat, half expecting him to suggest she leave it off for the occasion. He had said, "Why would you?" And that had been the end of that conversation. The 2 halves of the sunflower blanket stitched back together by Edna. Over the course of 3 careful evenings, lay across the back of the chair at the head of the table. May had asked her to do it not because she needed the symbol, but because the blanket was whole now, and whole was what it should be. After everyone had eaten, and the fire had burned lower, and the evening had settled into the comfortable noise of people who had all been through something together and come out on the other side of it, May stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the dark yard and the shape of the barn against the stars and the fence line running straight and solid into the distance, and Caleb came and stood beside her. "Still deciding?" he said. "No," she said, remembering. "What?" "That first night," she said, "standing in the bunkhouse, listening to all of this and thinking about how much work it needed." She paused. "I was calculating where to start. I didn't know yet that I was staying. I just knew the place needed someone who knew what they were doing. And now?" She looked at the ranch in the dark, the fence she had fixed and the barn with its new roof section and the house with its fresh paint and the pastures beyond, resting under the November cold, waiting for spring the way good land did. Not dying, just resting. "Now I know both things," she said. He put his arm around her shoulders, not dramatically, just the way you put your arm around someone when you are standing beside them and intend to keep standing beside them. The years that followed were not perfect, because nothing real ever was. There were bad winters and one truly terrible drought year when the north pasture went to dust and they lost more cattle than either of them wanted to count. And there were arguments, real ones, the kind that came from 2 strong-headed people trying to run a complicated thing together. And a period in the 3rd year when a dispute with a neighboring property over water rights went longer and uglier than it should have before both sides found the sense to settle it. May did not become easier to work with simply because she was no longer a temporary presence. She was exacting, and she had opinions, and she was not quiet about them. And there were hands who left because of that, and hands who stayed because of it, and hands who complained about her to Walt, who listened and then told them that in his 30 years of ranching, he had worked with exactly two people who knew cattle and land and people in equal measure, and one of them was her, and they could take it or leave it. Most of them stayed. She was not always patient with herself either. There were stretches when the old habits reasserted, when she caught herself thinking about other ranches, other problems, the particular restless energy of somewhere new, and she had to sit with those feelings and ask herself whether they meant something real, or whether they were just the residue of a long life spent moving, still working its way out of her system. She told Caleb about it, the third time it happened. Not the first or second time, because those times she thought she could manage it alone. The third time she sat down at his desk in the evening and said, "I need to tell you something." He put down his pen. She told him about the restlessness, about the specific texture of it, about how she'd had it all her life and she wasn't sure it ever fully went away. I was quiet for a moment. "Do you want to go?" he said. Not hurt, not afraid, just asking. "No," she said. "I want to stay. I always want to stay. I need you to know it's not effortless, that it's a decision I keep making." She looked at the desk. "You said that once, that staying is a decision you keep making." "I did," he said. "You were right," she said. "I'm making it. I wanted you to know I'm making it." He picked up his pen again. "I know," he said. "I see you making it." That was all. That was enough. Broken Ridge Ranch grew, slowly, not overnight, the way real things grew, with setbacks and adjustments and more than one moment where it looked like the growth would stall. May's operational methods became known in the county and then beyond it, and ranchers came to ask questions, and she answered them, not because she was generous with her time, but because good information in the hands of good people made the whole county stronger, and a stronger county was better land to operate in. She trained Rosa to manage specific aspects of the operation, and Rosa turned out to have instincts that May had not expected, and that she was honest enough to acknowledge were better than her own in certain areas, and she adjusted accordingly. That adjustment, that willingness to be wrong about something and change course, was one of the things the ranch hands talked about when they talked about May, though they talked about it only when she wasn't present. Edna Briggs stayed until she decided to stop staying, which happened on a morning in the 5th year when she announced at breakfast that her sister in Billings had a spare room and she had been thinking about it. May did not try to talk her out of it, because Edna had given 30 years to this house and earned the right to go where she chose. She did ask her to stay for the week it took to write down every recipe in the Broken Ridge kitchen, which Edna did, in a small notebook that May kept on the kitchen shelf and consulted with the regularity of a reference text. They corresponded by letter after that. Not constantly, but reliably. The kind of correspondence that did not require every detail to be interesting, that could include ordinary things like fence repairs and the price of feed, and a new hand who was either going to be very good or a considerable problem, and Edna would write back with opinions on all of it, sharply and without softening, because that was how Edna communicated affection. Walt retired in the 7th year to a small property east of town that his son helped him purchase, and on his last day at Broken Ridge, he came to May in the barn in the morning, before anyone else was up, and said, "You done right by this place." "We all did," she said. "I'm talking about you specific," he said. "You know what I mean." She looked at him. He was the first person at this ranch who had decided she was worth deciding on, and she had not forgotten that. She wouldn't. "Thank you, Walt," she said, "for the coffee that first morning." He nodded once, the way he'd always nodded, and walked out of the barn, and she listened to his footsteps until they were gone. She stood in the barn for a while after that. The morning light was coming in through the high window, the same window that had let amber light into the storage room years ago, while she'd stood with a burned blanket in her hands and a set of feelings she didn't have names for. She had names for them now. Most of them, anyway. Some things remained difficult to fully articulate, and she had made a kind of peace with that. She picked up her tools. She went to work. Caleb found her later that morning checking the water supply on the east line, and he rode up beside her and they worked the rest of the morning together without particular conversation. Just the natural division of a task between two people who had done enough things together that they no longer needed to narrate every step of it. At some point he said, "Walt got off all right?" Before sunrise, she said. He said goodbye this morning. What did he say? She checked the next water point. That we did right by the place. Caleb was quiet for a moment. He's not wrong. No, she said. He's not. They rode on. The land stretched out around them, the east fence running straight, the cattle moving slow and easy across the good pasture, the sky doing what Montana skies did in the late morning, filling up with light until there was almost too much of it. May thought sometimes, in the years that followed, about the woman she had been on that train platform, carrying someone else's sealed letter, with $12 in her pocket and a return ticket she was planning to sell. Standing in front of a crowd of strangers while a man she'd never met pointed at her and said that, and meaning it as an insult, and not knowing that the man he was talking to would shake her hand instead, and that the handshake would be the beginning of everything. She thought about what she would have said to herself that day, if she could have. She wasn't sure she would have said anything. The woman on the platform wouldn't have believed her. And also, and this was the thing she had come to understand slowly, the way you understood things that were large and required time, it wouldn't have been the right thing to do. The value of what she'd found at Broken Ridge was partly in the finding, in every decision that led there. In the coach station where a crying woman asked a favor of a stranger, and the stranger said yes because she was the only person there, and sometimes the job came to you. In the 30 days that became longer. In the storage room and the amber light and the burned edges of a blanket that had been waiting in a wooden crate to become whole again. Some things couldn't be shortcut. Some things had to be walked through, step by step, wrong door and right door and all of it, before you came out the other side knowing what you had. She knew what she had. She knew where she was.